In the dimly lit chambers of the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, where shadows danced across ancient stone walls, a lesson in human nature was being written that would echo through the centuries. The year was 1513, and Niccolò Machiavelli, recently fallen from grace after the return of the Medici family to power, sat at his wooden desk contemplating the intricate web of political betrayals he had witnessed throughout his career as a diplomat and political theorist. The candlelight flickered as Machiavelli recalled the events that had shaped his understanding of betrayal, not merely as an act of treachery, but as a predictable pattern of human behavior that could be observed, analyzed, and anticipated by those wise enough to recognize the signs. His experiences serving the Florentine Republic had taught him that betrayal was not a sudden lightning strike of malice, but rather a slow-burning fire that revealed itself through subtle indicators to those who knew how to read them. The first clue that betrayal is approaching lies in what Machiavelli termed the gradual withdrawal of confidence. This phenomenon manifests when individuals who once shared their thoughts freely begin to guard their words more carefully. In the political arena of Renaissance Italy, Machiavelli observed how former allies would start speaking in measured tones, their conversations becoming increasingly formal and devoid of the casual intimacy that once characterized their interactions. Consider the case of Cesare Borgia, whom Machiavelli had both admired and feared. In the months leading up to his downfall, those closest to Borgia began to exhibit this withdrawal of confidence. Ramiro de Lorqua, once Borgia's most trusted lieutenant in Romagna, started holding back information during their regular meetings. Where once he would share intelligence about local rebellions or the movements of enemy forces with enthusiasm and detail, he began offering only sanitized reports, keeping the most valuable intelligence to himself. This withdrawal is not immediately obvious to the victim. It occurs gradually, like the slow erosion of a riverbank. The betrayer does not suddenly become distant, instead, they begin to create small pockets of privacy where none existed before. They start having conversations in hushed tones with others, conversations that cease abruptly when the target approaches. They begin to forget to mention certain meetings or encounters that would previously have been shared as a matter of course. The psychological mechanism behind this behavior is self-preservation. The potential betrayer is already mentally preparing for the moment when loyalty will be abandoned, and this preparation requires them to begin distancing themselves emotionally and informationally from their intended victim. They cannot maintain the same level of openness and trust while simultaneously planning betrayal, so they unconsciously begin to pull back. Machiavelli noted that this withdrawal often coincides with what appears to be increased loyalty on the surface. The betrayer, feeling guilty about their planned treachery, often overcompensates by being more vocal about their devotion, more effusive in their praise, and more demonstrative in their public displays of allegiance. This creates a dangerous paradox where the victim receives mixed signals, formal distance in private combined with exaggerated loyalty in public. The second clue that betrayal is imminent is the subtle shift in questioning patterns. Machiavelli observed that those planning betrayal invariably begin to ask different types of questions. Where once their inquiries were focused on collaborative problem-solving and mutual interests, they begin to probe for information that serves their individual purposes rather than shared goals. In the court of Duke Valentino, Machiavelli witnessed this transformation in several key advisors. They began asking about the Duke's personal wealth, his private correspondence, his plans for succession, and his relationships with foreign powers, information that had little bearing on their official duties but would prove valuable if they were to switch sides or sell intelligence to enemies. These questions are often disguised as innocent curiosity or framed as necessary for the betrayer to better serve the victim's interests. I need to understand your financial position so I can better advise you on this investment, or tell me more about your conversation with the French ambassador so I can prepare appropriate follow-up communications. The victim, trusting in the relationship, provides this information freely, unknowingly arming their future betrayer with the tools of their own destruction. The shift in questioning patterns also reveals itself in timing. Betrayers begin to show unusual interest in schedules, travel plans, and future commitments. They want to know when the victim will be most vulnerable, when they will be away from their power base, or when they will be making important decisions that could be influenced or undermined. Machiavelli's third observation concerned what he called the multiplication of loyalties. Those preparing to betray their current allegiance almost always begin to diversify their relationships and create new networks of influence. This is both a practical necessity and an emotional preparation for the coming betrayal. In Florence, Machiavelli observed how Pier Soderini, the Gonfalonier of the Republic, began to lose the loyalty of his closest supporters not through any single dramatic event, but through the gradual realization that these supporters were hedging their bets. They started attending social gatherings hosted by potential rivals, accepting invitations to private dinners with opposition figures, and engaging in correspondence with foreign dignitaries who might prove useful if the political winds shifted. This multiplication of loyalties is rarely done openly. The betrayer maintains their official duties and public associations while quietly building alternative networks. They begin to cultivate relationships with people who were previously considered competitors or enemies. They start accepting favors from individuals outside their current circle of loyalty, creating debts and obligations that can be called upon later. The emotional preparation aspect of this behavior is equally important. By building relationships with the target's opponents, the betrayer begins to see their victim through different eyes. They start to internalize the criticisms and grievances of these new allies, providing themselves with moral justification for their planned betrayal. "I never realized how unfairly he treats his subordinates," or "I'm beginning to see that his policies are actually harmful to our cause." Part of this multiplication of loyalties involves the betrayer beginning to speak differently about shared enemies or competitors. Where once they would have dismissed criticisms of their current allegiance, they now begin to entertain these criticisms, finding merit in arguments they would have previously rejected outright. This shift in perspective serves to gradually erode their commitment to their current relationship while building emotional bridges to their future allies. The fourth clue Machiavelli identified was what he termed the acceleration of personal advancement. Those planning betrayal almost invariably begin to position themselves for personal gain in ways that are inconsistent with their current loyalties. This manifests as a sudden interest in accumulating resources, influence, or recognition that extends beyond their current role or relationship. In the case of Francesco Pazzi and the conspiracy against the Medici family, Machiavelli noted how the conspirators began to accumulate wealth and forge alliances in ways that made no sense within the context of their supposed loyalty to Florence and the existing power structure. Pazzi began moving money to foreign banks, acquiring property outside of Medici influence, and establishing business relationships that would prove valuable if he needed to flee Florence quickly. This acceleration of personal advancement often appears legitimate on the surface. The betrayer may claim they are simply being prudent about their future, diversifying their investments, or building their professional network. However, the pattern of these activities, when examined closely, reveals a person who is preparing for a future that does not include their current allegiances. The betrayer begins to seek recognition and advancement through channels that bypass their supposed loyalty. They may start writing letters to foreign powers, seeking appointments or positions that would conflict with their current obligations. They begin to position themselves as independent agents rather than loyal servants, building their personal brand in ways that diminish their identification with their current cause or leader. This behavior often includes the accumulation of compromising information about the intended victim. The betrayer starts keeping records of conversations, copying correspondence, and documenting decisions in ways that could be used later to damage their target's reputation or legal standing. They begin to see themselves as historians of their victims' failures rather than partners in their success. The psychological shift underlying this acceleration of personal advancement is significant. The betrayer is already living in a post-betrayal world, making decisions based on their anticipated future rather than their current obligations. This creates a fundamental misalignment between their actions and their professed loyalties, a misalignment that careful observers can detect if they know what to look for. Part 2, The Psychology of Treachery. As autumn settled over Florence and the leaves began their inevitable descent from the trees lining the Arno River, Machiavelli found himself contemplating the deeper psychological mechanisms that drove human betrayal. His observations of political treachery had revealed patterns that extended far beyond the mere calculation of advantage, reaching into the fundamental ways humans justify their actions and reconstruct their moral frameworks to accommodate betrayal. The fifth clue in Machiavelli's analysis centered on what he called the gradual revision of shared history. Those preparing to betray a relationship invariably begin to reinterpret past events in ways that cast their intended victim in a more negative light while portraying themselves as having been wronged, undervalued, or deceived. This revision of history serves multiple purposes for the betrayer. First, it provides moral justification for their planned treachery. By reframing their relationship as one of exploitation rather than mutual benefit, they can convince themselves that betrayal is not treachery but, rather, justice. Second, it allows them to build a narrative that they can share with their future allies, explaining why they are abandoning their current loyalty without appearing unreliable or opportunistic. Machiavelli observed this phenomenon most clearly in the relationship between Cesare Borgia and his father, Pope Alexander VI, and their various allies throughout the Papal States. As political fortunes shifted and alliances became inconvenient, former supporters would begin to recount their service in terms of sacrifice and exploitation rather than opportunity and advancement. Events that were once described as collaborative victories were reframed as instances where the betrayer had been forced to act against their better judgment. The process of historical revision typically begins with small reinterpretations of recent events. A decision that was once characterized as our choice becomes his decision that I had to support. A successful outcome that was previously celebrated as a team effort becomes recast as the betrayer's contribution being overlooked or undervalued. Gradually, this revisionism extends further into the past, recoloring the entire relationship. This revision of shared history is often accompanied by the betrayer beginning to share these reinterpretations with third parties. They start telling stories about their relationship that emphasize their victimization and their target's selfishness or incompetence. These conversations serve both to build support for their eventual betrayal and to practice the narrative they will use to justify their actions. The victim of this process rarely recognizes it initially because the betrayer does not directly confront them with these revised interpretations. Instead, the reframing occurs in conversations with others, gradually building a network of people who view the relationship through the betrayer's distorted lens. By the time the victim becomes aware of this narrative shift, it has often already taken hold in their broader community or organization. The sixth clue that betrayal is approaching reveals itself through what Machiavelli termed the emergence of conditional loyalty. This manifests when someone who previously offered unconditional support begins to attach conditions to their continued allegiance, even if these conditions are not explicitly stated. In his analysis of the collapse of various Italian city-states, Machiavelli observed how loyal supporters would begin to express their loyalty in terms of specific circumstances or achievements. "I will continue to support you as long as our policies remain successful," or "my loyalty depends on your ability to maintain our current position," were the kinds of statements that indicated wavering allegiance. This conditional loyalty often begins subtly, with the betrayer expressing concerns about the direction of their shared enterprise or the decision-making process of their supposed leader. They begin to position themselves as the voice of reason, suggesting that their continued support depends on certain changes being made or certain problems being addressed. The psychological mechanism behind conditional loyalty is the betrayer's need to maintain their self-image as a reasonable and principled person while preparing for betrayal. By establishing conditions for their loyalty, they create escape clauses that will allow them to abandon their allegiance without seeing themselves as treacherous. "I warned him that I couldn't support this direction," becomes their justification when they eventually switch sides. These conditions often escalate over time, becoming increasingly difficult to meet or increasingly unreasonable in their scope. The betrayer may demand greater influence over decisions, more recognition for their contributions, or changes in strategy that would effectively give them veto power over their supposed leader's actions. When these demands are not met, and they rarely can be met without fundamentally altering the power dynamic of the relationship, the betrayer has their justification for departure. Machiavelli noted that conditional loyalty also manifests in the betrayer's increasing emphasis on their own moral standards as separate from and superior to those of their current allegiance. They begin to speak of their principles as being in potential conflict with their loyalty, setting up a future choice between doing what they believe is right and maintaining their current relationships. The seventh and most subtle clue that Machiavelli identified was what he called the anticipation of consequences. Those planning betrayal invariably begin to act as if the negative consequences of their future treachery are already inevitable, making decisions and taking precautions that only make sense if they expect their current relationship to end badly. This anticipation manifests in numerous ways. The betrayer may begin to distance their family members from their intended victim, removing their loved ones from situations where they might be affected by the fallout from betrayal. They start making financial arrangements that would protect their assets if they were to suddenly lose their current position or income. They begin to avoid long-term commitments that would be difficult to honor if they were to switch allegiances. In the courts of Renaissance Italy, Machiavelli observed how courtiers planning betrayal would begin to decline invitations to events that were scheduled far in the future, avoid making promises that extended beyond their planned betrayal date, and start speaking about their future in vague terms that avoided specific commitments to their current allegiance. This anticipation of consequences also reveals itself in the betrayer's interactions with mutual friends and colleagues. They begin to test the waters, subtly exploring where others might stand if conflict were to arise. They ask hypothetical questions about loyalty and betrayal, gauge reactions to criticism of their intended victim, and identify potential allies for their future position. The betrayer's communication patterns also change as they begin to anticipate consequences. They become more careful about what they put in writing, more circumspect about their electronic communications, and more strategic about who they speak with and when. They begin to behave as if they are already under scrutiny, already suspected of disloyalty, even when no such suspicion exists. This anticipation of consequences is often the most reliable indicator of impending betrayal because it represents the betrayer's acknowledgement that their planned actions will have serious negative repercussions. Unlike the other clues, which can sometimes be explained by legitimate concerns or natural changes in relationships, the anticipation of consequences only makes sense if the person is planning actions that they know will be viewed as treacherous. Part 3: The Prevention and Navigation of Betrayal. As winter's grip tightened around Florence and snow began to dust the red-tiled roofs of the city, Machiavelli turned his attention from the identification of betrayal's warning signs to the more challenging questions of prevention and response. His years of diplomatic service had taught him that understanding the mechanics of treachery was only valuable if it could be applied to protect oneself and one's interests from its devastating effects. The recognition of these 7 clues, the withdrawal of confidence, the shift in questioning patterns, the multiplication of loyalties, the acceleration of personal advancement, the revision of shared history, the emergence of conditional loyalty, and the anticipation of consequences, provides a foundation for defensive action. However, Machiavelli understood that simply identifying potential betrayers was insufficient. One must also understand how to respond to these warning signs without triggering the very betrayal one seeks to prevent. The first principle in responding to suspected betrayal is what Machiavelli called the calibration of trust. This involves gradually adjusting the level of access and information provided to the suspected betrayer without making this adjustment obvious or confrontational. The goal is to limit the potential damage of betrayal while maintaining the relationship and, potentially even rehabilitating the wavering loyalty. Machiavelli observed this technique being employed successfully by Cosimo de' Medici in his dealings with various Florentine nobles whose loyalty had become questionable. Rather than confronting suspected betrayers directly or cutting them off completely, Cosimo would gradually shift their roles and responsibilities, moving them away from sensitive information and critical decisions while publicly maintaining their status and dignity. This calibration requires great skill and subtlety. If the suspected betrayer realizes that their access is being limited, it may accelerate their timeline for betrayal or convince them that their suspicions about being suspected are confirmed. The reduction in trust must appear natural, perhaps justified by changing circumstances or evolving responsibilities rather than by suspicion. One effective method for calibrating trust is to create multiple layers of information and access, providing the suspected betrayer with information that is accurate but incomplete, or tasks that are important but not critical. This allows you to continue working with them while limiting their ability to cause significant damage if they do betray your trust. The second principle involves what Machiavelli termed the strengthening of alternative loyalties. When facing potential betrayal from one source, it becomes crucial to reinforce and develop relationships with others who can provide the support, information, or capabilities that might be lost if the betrayal occurs. This principle extends beyond simply building redundancy in your relationships. It involves actively cultivating the loyalty of others through increased attention, trust, and opportunity. By strengthening your position with reliable allies, you both prepare for the potential loss of the wavering relationship and demonstrate to the potential betrayer that you are not dependent on their loyalty. Machiavelli noted that this strengthening of alternative loyalties often has the added benefit of making potential betrayers reconsider their plans. When they see that their defection would not significantly weaken their target, they may decide that the benefits of betrayal are not worth the costs and risks involved. However, this strategy must be implemented carefully to avoid creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. If the suspected betrayer notices that you are obviously building alternative relationships to replace them, it may convince them that betrayal is inevitable and prompt them to act more quickly than they otherwise would have. The third principle in navigating potential betrayal is the management of the betrayer's narrative. Since those planning betrayal invariably begin to revise shared history to justify their future actions, it becomes important to actively shape and control the narrative around your relationship and shared experiences. This involves being more deliberate about how events are documented, discussed, and remembered. When the suspected betrayer begins to reframe past events in conversations with others, it becomes important to provide alternative perspectives and ensure that your version of events is also heard and understood by your broader community or organization. Machiavelli observed that successful leaders often preempted betrayers' narrative revision by being more proactive about sharing their own perspectives on events and relationships. They would ensure that their interpretation of shared history was well established and widely accepted before the betrayer had the opportunity to revise it. This management of narrative also involves being careful about creating new events that could be misinterpreted or reframed in the future. When dealing with suspected betrayers, it becomes important to ensure that your interactions are witnessed by others, that your decisions are well documented and justified, and that your treatment of the suspected betrayer cannot be characterized as unfair or exploitative. The fourth principle involves what Machiavelli called the test of commitment. When suspecting potential betrayal, it can be valuable to create situations that require the suspected betrayer to demonstrate their loyalty through actions rather than words. These tests should be designed to reveal the true state of their allegiance without being so obvious as to feel like tests. Effective commitment tests often involve asking the suspected betrayer to take actions that would be difficult to reverse or that would damage their standing with your competitors or enemies. This might involve having them publicly defend your position on a controversial issue, asking them to recruit new supporters from their personal network, or requesting that they take on responsibilities that would be viewed negatively by your opposition. The key to effective commitment testing is ensuring that the requested actions are reasonable and legitimate within the context of the relationship. If the tests are too obvious or feel like loyalty oaths, they may prompt the suspected betrayer to accelerate their timeline for betrayal or may damage your relationship with others who view such tests as paranoid or manipulative. Machiavelli also emphasized the importance of observing not just whether the suspected betrayer complies with these tests, but how they comply. Reluctant compliance, compliance accompanied by complaints or conditions, or compliance that is technically adequate but lacking in enthusiasm can all be indicators that loyalty remains questionable even if the immediate test is passed. The fifth principle in navigating potential betrayal is the strategic revelation of knowledge. When you have identified signs of potential betrayal, it can be valuable to let the suspected betrayer know that you are aware of their wavering loyalty without directly confronting them about it. This can sometimes prevent betrayal by making the betrayer realize that their plans are not as secret as they believed. This strategic revelation must be handled with great subtlety. Direct confrontation often accelerates betrayal rather than preventing it, as it forces the betrayer to choose between abandoning their plans or proceeding more quickly than they had intended. Instead, the revelation should be indirect, allowing the suspected betrayer to understand that you are aware of their activities without requiring them to respond directly. One effective method for strategic revelation is to make casual comments that demonstrate your awareness of the betrayer's new relationships or changed priorities. "I heard you had an interesting conversation with opponent last week," delivered in a neutral tone, can be enough to let the betrayer know that their activities are being noticed without creating a confrontational situation. Another approach involves sharing information about the consequences of betrayal in general terms, making it clear that you understand the risks and have prepared for them without specifically accusing anyone of planning treachery. This can serve as both a warning and a deterrent, making potential betrayers reconsider whether their plans are worth the risks involved. The sixth principle involves the creation of positive incentives for loyalty. While identifying and responding to signs of betrayal is important, Machiavelli understood that prevention is always preferable to reaction. Creating strong positive incentives for loyalty can prevent wavering relationships from developing into active betrayal. These incentives must go beyond simple rewards or benefits, they must address the underlying needs and desires that make betrayal attractive. If someone is considering betrayal because they feel undervalued, providing them with greater recognition and responsibility may restore their loyalty. If they are motivated by fear for their security, offering them protection or guarantees may prevent their defection. Machiavelli observed that the most effective positive incentives for loyalty were those that made the potential betrayer's success dependent on your continued success. When people's personal advancement is tied to your welfare, they have strong reasons to remain loyal even when faced with tempting alternatives. However, these incentives must be genuine and sustainable. False promises or temporary benefits that cannot be maintained long-term may actually accelerate betrayal by confirming the potential betrayer's suspicions that their current situation is unstable or unsustainable. The seventh and final principle in navigating potential betrayal is the preparation for inevitable loss. Despite all efforts at prevention and management, some betrayals cannot be avoided. Machiavelli understood that accepting this reality and preparing for it was essential for long-term survival and success. This preparation involves both practical and psychological elements. Practically, it means ensuring that no single relationship is so critical to your success that its loss would be devastating. This requires building redundancy in your support networks, diversifying your sources of information and assistance, and maintaining the capability to function independently when necessary. Psychologically, preparation for betrayal involves accepting that not all relationships will endure and that loyalty is often conditional and temporary. This acceptance does not mean becoming cynical or paranoid, but rather maintaining realistic expectations about human nature and relationships. Machiavelli noted that leaders who were best able to survive and thrive despite betrayal were those who viewed it as a normal part of human interaction rather than a personal failure or catastrophic event. They understood that betrayal often reflected changing circumstances and competing interests rather than moral failings, and they were able to respond pragmatically rather than emotionally. This pragmatic approach to betrayal also involves understanding when to forgive and when to retaliate. Some betrayals reflect temporary lapses in judgment or unavoidable conflicts of interest that can be resolved through communication and adjustment. Others represent fundamental incompatibilities or hostile intentions that require decisive response. The key is distinguishing between these different types of betrayal and responding appropriately to each. Overreacting to minor betrayals can damage your reputation and relationships with others who might view your response as disproportionate. Underreacting to serious betrayals can encourage further treachery and signal weakness to potential future betrayers. As Machiavelli completed his analysis in the flickering candlelight of that Florence winter, he reflected on the broader implications of understanding betrayal's hidden signs. The ability to recognize and respond to these clues was not merely a tool for personal survival or advancement, but a fundamental skill for anyone seeking to navigate the complex web of human relationships that define all social and political systems. The 7 clues he had identified: withdrawal of confidence, shifted questioning patterns, multiplication of loyalties, acceleration of personal advancement, revision of shared history, emergence of conditional loyalty, and anticipation of consequences, formed a comprehensive framework for understanding how loyalty transforms into treachery. More importantly, the principles for responding to these clues provided a roadmap for maintaining relationships and protecting interests even in the face of inevitable human inconstancy. Machiavelli understood that the goal was not to create a world without betrayal, which would be impossible given human nature, but rather to build systems and relationships that could withstand betrayal and continue to function effectively despite the occasional loss of individual loyalties. The strongest leaders and most enduring institutions were those that expected betrayal, prepared for it, and had developed the flexibility to adapt when it occurred. In the end, the greatest protection against betrayal was not the ability to prevent it entirely, but the wisdom to recognize it early, the skill to manage it effectively, and the resilience to survive and thrive despite its occurrence. These capabilities, Machiavelli believed, were essential not just for princes and political leaders, but for anyone seeking to build lasting success in a world where human loyalty was always subject to the changing winds of circumstance and opportunity. The document he had created that winter night in Florence would serve as a guide for understanding one of humanity's most enduring challenges. The 7 hidden clues he had identified would help countless future readers navigate their own relationships and protect their own interests from the inevitable betrayals that awaited them in their personal and professional lives. In providing this knowledge, Machiavelli hoped to arm them with the tools necessary not just to survive in a world of shifting loyalties, but to thrive within it.